Excellent. So really my goal today is to talk about dementia and sexual expression and how we can honor a person's dignity and autonomy while maintaining safety from harm and exploitation. So y'all might remember Sandra Day O'Connor. She was the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court in the United States. And her husband had a dementia disorder and lived in a long-term care community. While he was living in long-term care, he started a relationship with another woman living in long-term care. And Sandra Day O'Connor and their children would go and visit him. And Sandra Day O'Connor was quoted as saying that she isn't jealous of the other woman, rather that she's glad that he is comfortable. You might remember a few years ago, Sandra Day O'Connor herself was diagnosed with a dementia disorder. And she was again quoted as saying, "While the final chapter of my life with dementia may be trying, nothing has diminished my gratitude and deep appreciation for the countless blessings in my life." You will discover that I too have many values as I talk about this. And one of my values is that I hope that Sandra Day O'Connor herself is afforded the same grace and opportunity to build a new relationship and intimacy as she afforded her own husband. So because we're talking about intimacy today, and we gave a little disclaimer at the beginning about this being recorded, but nobody's faces or names will be on the video itself, I also want to engage in a little informed consent process. In this discussion today, we'll be talking about sex and intimacy. Intimate language will be used. I share photos of people caressing and hugging. You'll see some skin. In my opinion, all pretty appropriate, but it's important for you to know and to make a decision if this is the right time for you to be taking this discussion or workshop, or if you need to take a break, whatever you need. Honor yourself and your own needs. I also want to say this is not legal advice or mental health or medical advice, and the law varies from state to state. So if you're facing some of the dilemmas that we'll discuss today, it's really important to consult attorneys and professionals in your state. And while I do use up-to-date research, the opinions expressed here are mine and may not reflect the institutions that I'm affiliated with, like University of Vermont Medical Center or the American Psychological Association. As was stated, I am founder of the Center for Mental Health and Aging. Our goal is really to destigmatize mental health and sexual health for older adults and ensure that older adults get the mental health and sexual health care that they need. And we offer continuing education for professionals, public education for older adults and families, and also have a national provider directory of mental health providers in various states who provide mental health care to older adults and their families. And this is really born out of a significant need that the vast majority of older adults in need of mental health care are not getting it. And the mental health care that they tend to get is through primary care, which for many older adults is not sufficient. And so my goal is to change this. And similarly, as we'll discover today, the same story can be told related to sexual health. And that's sexual health for the typical older adult, as well as for older adults living with life-altering medical conditions like dementia disorders. And so if you'd like to learn more, I'd love to invite you over there. It's www.mentalhealthandaging.com. There are lots of podcasts, articles, and courses. And for professionals, you get continuing education for participating. All right, so I'm gathering that you are here today because you maybe feel uncertain about where to start when it comes to dementia and sexual health. Perhaps you need guidance as you navigate dementia and sexuality, and perhaps are hopeful that there are tools to help you balance sexual autonomy with safety. I'll just say, while you're here, to really make this conversation count, it's very rare that we get opportunities to talk about sexuality and sexual health among people living with dementia and the people who love them. And so I invite you to really turn off all your distractions and make this count. I want to start with this premise that we can find ways to balance sexual autonomy and maintain safety for all involved. It's not an either or, it's really a balancing act. And when we get into these either or mindsets, we risk, on one hand, violating human rights, and on the other hand, exposing people to exploitation and harm. And so really it is a balancing act. And education, like the opportunity we have today, is one way to find balance and to learn how to achieve that. So where are we going? So I'm going to start by talking about the facts about aging and sexual health. And it's really important that we just have the facts about aging and sexual health. And that's because dementia disorders, as you all know, take place most often in the context of aging. And so it's important that we understand what's typical among older people when it comes to sexuality, and then that will help sort of guide us in thinking about people living with dementia. Next, we'll explore your own values. As I shared earlier, I have my own values in doing this work. Then we'll talk about sexual consent in the context of dementia, why every long-term care community needs a sexual health policy and guidelines, and then recommendations for caregivers in long-term care communities. And then, of course, we'll have live Q&A throughout the process. All right, so I'd like you just to engage in an exercise with me for a minute, and you can just do this in your own mind. So what comes to mind when I say older adults and sex? What comes to mind? What comes to mind when I say older adults with dementia and sex? Do your thoughts come with myths, taboos, personal beliefs, prejudices, negative attitudes? Do your thoughts about sex differ between men and women, heterosexual versus same-sex couples, cisgender versus trans or non-binary folks? Have you received any training on intimacy or sexuality when it comes to aging or people living with dementia? If you consult or work within long-term care, or your family members in long-term care, do you know the long-term care's policies about sex and intimacy between residents? Have they shared those with you? I'm just curious in the chat, if anybody wants to share any reflections. Did you notice any reflections for yourself that you're willing to share? And if you're comfortable, you can drop it in the chat.
While we wait for the chat to open up, I'll start by saying I've been working in this specific area of social work for almost 10 years now, and I have never once received any training on, or formalized training, I should say, on intimacy or sexuality
Wow.
with older adults with dementia.
Wow. And so what's your thought about that? Is that a deficiency? Is
Yes,
that, what do you attribute
absolutely.
that
I think
to?
it's a deficiency in my master's education and continuing education. I think it's still a taboo, one of the last taboos people feel uncomfortable or afraid to talk about.
Yes. Somebody shared with me privately, I won't share their name, but most long-term care communities say no to sex, even holding hands and kissing. Yes. I've consulted with many long-term care communities where there's a hands-off policy, like we had in middle school, which is very infantilizing. Another person privately messaged me that says sex and aging is almost as taboo as death and aging. And I would say it's probably even more in my experience of working with older folks and older families, sometimes I think it's even more taboo than death and aging. Another person shared privately, I'm a support group facilitator and get a lot of questions about sexual acting out inappropriately, but the age group I deal with considers it taboo and wouldn't discuss it, especially with most of them being female and me being male. Oh, interesting. Yeah, there are indeed gender dynamics and age dynamics. I'm 46. I'll be 47 next month. The vast majority of people I work with are old enough to be my parents. And so there are also generational barriers, like, there's also a significant boundary in terms of generational differences between my age and the people I'm working with. And so I have to acknowledge those differences. Sometimes I had babies while I was working with people. So my clients would see me pregnant, and often they'd be losing their loved one to a dementia disorder. And I would say, we'd be doing grief work, and I would say, this must be so complex. I'm starting my family. I would be pregnant in the therapy room, and you're saying goodbye to yours. And so just making the implicit explicit can help to bridge some of these conversations as well. And then I would say, and you're saying goodbye to yours, and tell me how that is for you, that you're talking with me while I'm starting a family, and you're saying goodbye. And so that can help to bridge the gap in some of these boundaries that exist between us, and sometimes healthy boundaries, especially between aging parents and adult children. And so there can be some natural boundaries that are healthy that also put adult children in complex situations when they're called in to make decisions for their parents with dementia. And so we're going to get into some of those complex situations as we move forward. Well, thanks for this healthy chat, everybody. All right, so let's learn a little bit about the facts about sex and aging. Are older adults even having sex, right? So all of those taboos that we just talked about and stereotypes would have us believe that older adults are no longer interested in sex, when in fact, a survey of 1,000 adults between 65 and 80, so this survey was done in 2018, and of course, because it's a large data set, people are still extracting, or researchers are still extracting the data and writing up articles about it. And so this survey, again, was of 1,000 adults between the ages of 65 and 80, and it found that 67% of older adults are interested in sex, or 67% of adults between 65 and 80 are interested in sex. 72% of them identified having a partner, and of the people who are partnered, 54% report being sexually active. The study also found that 51% of men and close to 31% of women report being sexually active. So hopefully that shattered some of the stereotypes and taboos that we've all been dealt. So of course we know that over our lifespan, our libido can decline. And so health conditions that we're more vulnerable to as we age can impact libido and sex drive, like diabetes, heart disease, chronic pain, arthritis, Parkinson's disease, stroke, dementia disorders. This month, I'm partnering with American Parkinson's Disease Association, who just came out with a really cool Parkin Sex kit. At the end of this presentation, I have it right next to me. I'll show you, because I'm doing this campaign with American Parkinson's Disease Association to talk about intimacy in the context of Parkinson's disease. And because we know, when there are changes in dopamine in the brain, as there are with Parkinson's, it can impact physiologically sexual functioning, and people may no longer be able to have an erection. And so how do you cultivate intimacy even when your body is not working as it once did? And so health conditions can change our sexual functioning, as can mental health and substance use disorders like depression or alcohol use, and the medications that we take for all of these conditions. Of course, then there are changes in physiology with andropause, which is the slow decline of testosterone over time with men, and menopause with women, and that can lead to difficulty with lubrication. And then, as we discussed earlier, ageist stereotypes. So this idea that at a certain age, people are no longer sexual, or older adults are asexual, or that sexuality becomes unimportant, or that in fact there's a belief that it's abnormal for older adults to be interested in sex. And if you are interested in sex, then you're perverse or unusual, rather than, as we saw just a minute ago, the majority of people, the vast majority of older adults, 2/3 remain interested in sex. And that's because intimacy and sexuality is a basic human need. They're fundamental and intrinsic to our sense of well-being and self. At any age, we require companionship, intimacy, and love. Advanced age or cognitive impairment do not erase the need for affection, intimacy, relationships, warmth, and touch. And in fact, if we think about Maslow's hierarchy, if you can see me, I'm holding up a triangle if you can't see me for people who are using closed caption. And Maslow's hierarchy, as we know, is a triangle. At the base is eating and excretion and sex. And in the middle is sex. And because in the middle is where we have intimacy and relationships. And at the base is where we have sexual functioning, like ejaculation and excretion, and that goes along with excretion. And so this is where it's fundamental to our sense of self and humanity. It's as core as eating. And sometimes we'll talk about sexuality and sexual expression like we talk about eating. And in a little while, we'll talk about consent. And I have an example when it comes to eating as well. All right, so an important concept that we're going to be talking about today is sexual self-determination. So this is a fundamental human right by most living in Western societies. So, and that it suggests that we are able to engage in sexual behavior whenever and with whomever we choose, as long as the parties are consensual. And so that's sexual self-determination. When it comes to sexual expression among older adults, there are some forms of sexual expression that are seen as acceptable, like holding hands or hugging and kissing, and other forms of sexual expression among older people that are seen like patting and stroking and intercourse that are met with concern and shock and outrage. But of course, we know, as we're moving into talking about sexuality and dementia, that we know that one of the ways I think about dementia is a process of fragmentation of self, like pieces of yourself that you're familiar with, that you could trust, the way that you would think about things, manage things is becoming fragmented. And so it's essential that we maintain a sense of humanity in the midst of this fragmentation, like a lighthouse in the storm. We know that people with dementia require stimulation and companionship, have the need to feel secure, have the need to feel unique and valued, and to feel a sense of self-esteem, just like people not living with dementia. And so it often surprises me and begs the question, so why are we so surprised when residents living in the same long-term care community and with dementia disorders start an intimate relationship? Residents in the same community are likely living together for the rest of their lives. It makes sense that they would pair off into intimate relationships, as it's actually quite normal for people to do that. But because of these stereotypes, and I would say we're moving from ageism now to ableism, this discrimination against people living with dementia, that creates more taboo even for people living with dementia, when indeed it's quite natural for people living in close quarters, like long-term care communities, to pair off and form relationships. So this is a little bit leading, and so I have to correct something in a minute. But I would also say, living with an illness like dementia can be incredibly difficult and scary and painful for the person living with dementia as well. It makes sense that we would reach to others for closeness. I say that this is leading because not everybody who's alone, right, is sad to be alone. I lived alone in my own apartment until I was 38, and I loved it. But I'm looking forward to the day, now I have little kids, and I'm looking forward to the day for solitude, right? But and so people might or might not want to be in a relationship, living in long-term care, and whatever their preference is fine. And so this is a little bit leading because sometimes I'll ask, what would you rather be living alone or in partnership, or living alone and being in partnership with somebody who doesn't share your same space? And so I want to ask in the chat, when you imagine your life, maybe there are people here living with dementia, but imagine your life living with dementia. Would you prefer to be living alone happily or partnered happily? What would your preference be? Drop it in the chat. Would you prefer to be living alone or partnered happily? Partnered. I see people messaging me directly. Sometimes I ask this and many people will say alone, partnered. Yeah, last week I was presenting, or 2 weeks ago, I was presenting at a conference in Atlanta at the American Society on Aging. And I was in a lift, and I was maybe multiple partners. Oh, I love that. Okay, alone in space, but partnered. Yeah, I might like that too. So like maybe you have your own room and then have a relationship that you share. Partnered, another person says. So I was driving in a Lyft, and I think the Lyft driver was driving very erratically, and it was scary and it was unusual. I have many other Lyft drivers who were very excellent drivers, but I told this driver, "Don't kill me. My children need their mother." And it got to this conversation where it's like, actually, my children need a mother is what I first said. And then I said, well, actually, my children need me. I want to be there. I want to watch them grow and be their mother. And because I said to the driver, my husband would probably find a partner, and I would want my husband to find a partner because he loves being partnered. He loves being in relationships. And so, and the driver thought like, oh, wow, interesting that you would want your partner like right after you died to be in a relationship. Maybe not the next day, but, and I said, yeah, I really want my partner to be happy, and I want my kids to be happy. And if my partner's happy, my kids are more likely to be happy if I died young. And he thought it was unusual that I would have such a frank conversation about it. But the idea is, like, some of us just want to be partnered and thrive in partnership. And I think I'm one of those people too. I tend to be a serial monogamist, or was early in my life. But of course, when we talk about dementia and sexuality, there are many benefits and risks. And so we're going to dive into some of the benefits and risks. There are specific benefits of intimacy in community care settings. Before I jump there, I want to hear in the chat, are you, if you have a loved one living with dementia, are they living in long-term care? Do they live with you? Or if you're a professional, do you consult with long-term care or families in the community? Say long-term care or in the community. Drop it in the chat just so I have a sense of husband lives with me. I'm not sure why all the chats are going to you instead of me. Sorry about that. No problem, Allison. Both long-term care and home. Yeah, families in community. Excellent. All right. Parents live together in a home. Dad in their own home. I'm guessing dad has dementia. Thanks. I'm glad you're here. Any other? Own home. Thanks for that clarification. Husband temporarily in assisted living. Thanks for being here. Temporarily, that's a tough transition, sounds like. Okay. So I'm going to focus here on intimacy in community care settings, but of course, intimacy happens everywhere, even in the home. And so we'll talk a bit about that too. So there are benefits of intimacy in community care settings. So this is like long-term care communities, in that intimacy can bring happiness, joy, and meaning to a person's life. It can create a sense of home and belonging, shared trust, warmth, humor, touch, comfort, and safety. And it also can enhance the quality of a person's life. Intimacy has been shown to reduce depressive symptoms, improve behaviors, enhance general health, and improve well-being. But of course, There are risks of intimacy in long-term care communities. There's a risk for the older adult or resident. There's a risk for the institution, a risk for the residents' families, and risks related to dementia disorders. So for the older adult or a resident, there's the risk of exploitation. There's a risk of psychological or physical abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, social rejection by staff or other residents, and harassment by family members of the sex partner. There might even be harassment of one's own family. And I'll share a story. There's a woman who, Lori LeBray, I think is her name. And she and I were talking about her mom. She's open about this story and her mom's dementia journey. Her mom was living in long-term care. Her mom had, I think, been married to her dad for decades, but the dad had died earlier and the mom was living with dementia in long-term care. And the mom started a new relationship and seemed to be very happy and was in this new relationship and was eager and looking forward to her new partner living in long-term care. Also, they would hold hands and have meals together and sit next to each other, movie time, and kind of had the arrangement that somebody thought would be ideal for them was she had her own room, but then she had this relationship in the long-term care community, sort of in the shared spaces where they would eat together, watch movies together in shared spaces, and she seemed very, very happy and like she was her best self living with dementia. The partner appeared to be non-binary, was a woman and appeared to be non-binary, and Lori describes being very happy that her mom was in a relationship and not caring who the relationship was really with, man or woman, a person who's transgender or non-binary, didn't matter to her. But Lori said that one day, somebody told the mom that, like, did you know you're in a relationship with a woman? And Lori doesn't know who shared that with the mom. And following that, the mom was stopped the relationship, started to become more withdrawn and depressed, maybe embarrassed, I don't know, or felt shame. I don't know how the information was delivered to her, but she stopped the relationship altogether and became more withdrawn and socially isolated in the long-term care community. She no longer ate with meals with her former partner, and so on. Lori suspects that was one of her brothers who revealed the identity and was very concerned that it had a negative impact on her mom, that perhaps the family member, the brother's discomfort, and this is conjecture, we don't know what happened, but perhaps one of the brothers was uncomfortable with the mom's sex partner and then may have revealed that it was not appropriate, and then that ended the relationship. But what can also happen is that not every family member is on the same page when it comes to resident A, or maybe all the family members of resident A are on the same page, but maybe not resident B, not resident B's family member. And so it can get really messy if one set of family members are okay with the relationship and one set of family members are not okay with the relationship. Then there's, of course, risk for the institution. And so that can be in the form of the facility actually has the responsibility of protecting its residents from unreasonable harm resulting from sexual activity. It has the risk of being sued and has the risk of losing its license. In October, as I was doing offering my dementia and sexual health certification program, I was training Illinois ombudsmen, and they were sharing with me different examples of long-term care communities in Illinois who didn't have a sexual health policy, who didn't have consent guidelines or use consent guidelines, that when sexual interactions were amplified, that it resulted in residents being harmed, and then the long-term care communities being fined $400,000. And this was examples of a few different long-term care communities in Illinois. And so it's really, this conversation is so important because of course people have the right to be intimate, and we have the responsibility of understanding what's appropriate sexual behavior, what's not appropriate, how do we intervene, how do we assess for that. And so the institution has some responsibility of managing a person's rights with, or balancing a person's rights with responsibility to maintain safety. And so there's also the risk for the family. So there's a risk of not honoring the residents' wishes or values. There's a risk of failing the loved one if they make the wrong decision, or the risk of impeding on the loved one's quality of life. And then there are unique issues related to dementia disorders. There's hypersexuality with dementia. There's the question of, can the person consent to intimacy? Does the person understand the relationship? And does the person know their sex partner, or do they misidentify them for somebody else? So of course, this results in many dilemmas. And of course, a dilemma is a complicated situation in which a difficult choice has to be made between often competing options. So it's a dilemma for the care community in that it's the resident's home, it's an agency and community, and it's a staff's place of work. So let's look a little bit deeper at sexual expression in care communities. And I saw a question in the chat about adding sexual preferences to living wills. And that's a common question that comes up here, like, could you have a sexual advance directive? And we'll talk about that at the end, because there are a lot of components to sexual consent that are kind of more similar to end of life care in terms of the nuances. But the issue with sexual consent, and maybe we'll get into this, I'm going to hold that and get into that when we talk about consent. So let's look a little bit deeper at sexual expression in care communities. So Gail Dahl was a researcher. She's recently retired, but she's a champion in this work. She surveyed nursing homes in Kansas and found that virtually all the nursing homes that she surveyed included, their residents were sexually expressive. In 85% of the communities she surveyed, there were sexual acts, there was sexual talk, the majority had romance, implied sex acts, and also false allegations of sex or sexual relationships with others. They surveyed also, how did the staff react to resident sexual expression? The majority of staff asked a supervisor, what do I do? About 51% tried to respectfully help the resident. 41% followed the facility policy. What's interesting is most facilities don't have a sexual health policy. I'm guessing because Gail Dahl was in Kansas that she really championed this work in Kansas. And so probably more people there, or more long-term care communities there, had a sexual health policy. About a third responded with disgust. Close to a third ignored the issue. 20% panicked, and close to 20% did something else. And when she surveyed these long-term care communities, she also asked them about LGBTQ residents. And here's how some of the programs responded. Well, this is a rural area. Most people are heterosexual, which is problematic because, of course, LGBTQ people live everywhere. We currently use the same process as the military, don't ask, don't tell, which is also problematic because that was repealed. And we have residents that have behavior issues, and we know or knew when we admitted them that they have a history of talking inappropriately or that they masturbate. We have not had any issues with gay, lesbian, etc. So this last comment is problematic because it equates non-heterosexual relationships and orientation with problematic behavior. And so that's setting LGBTQ residents up to fail and to experience harassment and hostility. And so we know that LGBTQ folks have a pretty different experience in long-term care than non-LGBTQ folks. So Gail Dahl's research really points to 3 key points, and suggests that resident sexual expression covers a wide variety of activity from flirtation to sexual intercourse and is evident in nearly every nursing home. I have myself done large workshops in Washington and Oregon and all over the US, and also have found that yes, sexual expression occurs everywhere, and because it's human. And 2, reactions to these activities by family and staff member, especially nursing staff, can be quite negative and interfere with a resident's quality of life. And 3, sexual expression policies and staff and family training and education can improve the likelihood that residents' intimacy needs are met. So there was a great banner at the front of the Boston Pride Parade of older women carrying a banner that read 2468, don't assume your grandma's straight. And then I want to add 1, 2, 3, 4, check your bias at the door. I want to start also this section by saying, in my own therapy practice, not with people living with dementia, I was working with 2 older men separate from one another in their individual therapies. And they both shared with me that they had had same-sex relationships earlier in their life. They suspected that they were gay, didn't have language to talk about their sexual orientation, couldn't talk about their sexual orientation. And then in the context of therapy, decades later, one man was 76, the other man was 83. Decades later, were married to women and were in a committed, loving relationship, but longed for the type of intimacy that they had earlier in their life with men. And they wondered, like, how do I don't want to end my life, or reach the end of my life without knowing this type of intimacy again, and not having even the language for it. And so somebody wrote in the chat, yeah, what about SAGE USA? So SAGE is a great educator for LGBTQ aging. It's sageusa.org. They're a national nonprofit organization that provides support and education surrounding LGBTQ aging. And I did actually recommend one of the men that I was working with who was very curious about getting educated about LGBTQ aging and what all the terms mean and where he fit. And so I actually encouraged him to call a support line there and get lots of questions answered from other older LGBTQ older adults. So I just want to share a bit about LGBTQ older adults and some of the unique concerns that they are experiencing in long-term care. So 48% of LGBT couples experience adverse treatment when seeking senior housing. Transgender individuals experience adverse treatment at even higher rates. Half the LGBT population lives in states with no laws prohibiting housing discrimination against them. And 34% of LGBT older adults fear having to recloset themselves when seeking senior housing. That was information from sageusa.org. The Diverse Elders Coalition, which is another conglomerate of national nonprofit organizations like racial and ethnic minority organizations, and Sage USA got together and put together a great guide. And they found that 78% of LGBT older adults go back into the closet when entering a nursing home or assisted living, and which is horrific, right? Which is unacceptable, and we have to do better. Many long-term care communities now, with the help of Sage USA, are implementing anti-harassment policies, because what also can happen is if an LGBTQ person is out in long-term care, there's the risk of harassment, like we learned earlier. So also an important discussion that we need to have is around transgender and gender nonconforming aging. And so one of my colleagues, Mark Brennan in New York, wrote an article entitled "A Fate Worse Than Death: Being Transgender in Long-Term Care." So plans for concealing gender identities, suicide, and euthanasia, Mark wrote, are ways for older transgender and gender nonconforming adults to cope with the fears of entering long-term care. Transgender and gender nonconforming older adults, regardless of their degree of gender transitioning, are at risk for abuse, mistreatment, or violence in institutionalized settings, especially those needing assistance with activities of daily living, like showering, dressing, and toileting. And so it's critical that we're also implementing anti-harassment and anti-discrimination programs and guidelines, and also providing training and education for staff and for families who are visiting long-term care communities as well. So this brings us to kind of getting clear about what your own values are about sexuality and aging and dementia and sexual expression. So let's look at, I want you to think about your own values. So this is kind of small, so I'll read it out loud, but I want you to rate yourself on these questions. So how much do you agree or disagree with this statement? A married couple with one spouse living in the community and the other one with dementia residing in a care facility is entitled to being sexually intimate in a private place within the facility. How much do you agree to disagree? And you can write it in the chat or just keep it private. Sure, I'll read it again. A married couple with one spouse living in the community and the other one with dementia residing in a care facility is entitled to be sexually intimate in a private place within the facility. How much do you agree or disagree? I'll move to the next one. There's a question about consent. So the next one, 2 residents, both of whom have dementia, are entitled to an exclusive and consensual relationship, but should not be sexually intimate if one of them is married to another person. How much do you agree or disagree? 2 residents, both of whom have dementia, are entitled to an exclusive and consensual relationship, but should not be sexually intimate if one of them is married to another person. I love these. The responses are disagree, but one maybe. All right, let's try some more. A resident is entitled to masturbate in private as long as his or her personal safety is ensured. A resident is entitled to masturbate in private as long as their personal safety is ensured. All right. 2 residents who are of the same sex are entitled to have a close friendship, but sexual activity between them is unacceptable. 2 residents of the same sex are entitled to have a close friendship, but sexual activity between them is unacceptable. And last one, if family members object to a relative with dementia having sexual relations with others, it's the duty of the staff to prevent such activity. If family members object to a person with dementia, their relative, having sexual relations with others, it's the duty of the staff to prevent such activity. So if the family members are not in favor of their loved one with dementia having a relationship with somebody else, the staff should prevent the activity. Okay, some people say disagree, invite the family to move the resident. Families have moved residents when they've even started relationships, which is can be very distressing to the residents, of course. So I'm curious, which of these items were easy to answer and why? What sort of questions did you find were coming up for you when you were answering these? Did any questions take longer to answer or had you stuck or paused? And sort of what are your questions from here? Like what's percolating in your mind? Let me go back. So what sort of came up for you? One thing that came up as I was reading these were, can the person consent? That was consulting with the family. Let's see. Yeah, more questions about consent. All right, so studies show that actually, as we saw earlier, older adults and long-term care residents continue to value and enjoy sexual relationships. We know this. That older LGBTQ people are concerned about discrimination as they age and value safety, equity, and dignity. And that there are unique values of family members and challenges for family members. So adult children of older residents are often more likely to oppose sexual contact between their parents and other residents. For approving family members, only some types of behaviors are approved of. Many families believe that they should be kept informed of their relatives' sexual behaviors and be involved in decision-making about it. And spouses tend to be more accepting of romantic relationships between their spouse and another long-term care resident than adult children tend to. And this one makes sense to me because what can happen, of course, we were talking about some of the generational differences. If we think about most parents and children throughout the course of life, most parents and children are not talking about their sexual desires or interests or relationships. And that's actually healthy that we have a separation, right, in terms of the bedroom and parenting or our parental sort of relationships. And so the person who tends to know our sexual interests and desires tend to be the person we're having sex with, right, outside of ourselves, which is more commonly than not a spouse. And so spouses, it makes sense to me, are more accepting of romantic relationships between their spouse and another long-term care resident like Sandra Day O'Connor. The challenge for adult children, though, like I don't want to throw adult children under the bus. There are real challenges. And some of those challenges are, kind of honoring what they knew. Like, did their loved one always say, I would never have another relationship outside of your mother or your father, right? And are they honoring that? Or are they honoring their wish for that? Like, so it can get very blurry when it comes to any family member, but especially for adult children. I think they're in a really difficult situation. And of course, then there are values of staff. So a resident's personal choice is not always valued due to conflicting personal values between staff and residents. Sexual expression among residents is not seen as a preferred resident behavior. And many staff members do not believe that older residents' discussions of sexuality or maintaining an attractive self-image are important. And this is back to what shapes our values, was often where we put time and attention, right? And so if we think about Allison's experience of working in this field for 10 years, but never receiving any education or training or guidelines around sexual health and dementia, how will it be for her to develop values around this if she doesn't even have like a foundational knowledge? And it's not just it's everyone, right, who's doing dementia care. There's very limited and information related to dementia and sexual expression, including how well we honor and a person's right to sexual expression. So as you can see, there are lots of competing values. We have to balance the risks of sexual activity with the individual's right to autonomy and the values, preferences, and sexual needs of the older adult. The care facility has to balance an individual's needs and rights with the family members' wishes, with institutional and state policies. DPOHA here is Durable Power of Health Attorney. All of this while balancing our own values. Again, creating dilemma. This sort of friction between a right to sexual expression, autonomy, and privacy with our duty to protect. So often questions arise like, do either or both residents misidentify one another for a spouse? Is the relationship consistent with each person's past values? Do past values always apply in this context? To what extent should others be allowed to make decisions about the relationships of people with dementia engaging in intimacy? Who decides and how do we make these decisions? Is it appropriate to characterize a relationship between two residents who are married but whose spouses live in the community as an extramarital affair? What about if your loved one lives in a long-term care community and has been living in long-term care for 5 years and doesn't recognize you anymore, and you decide to have a relationship? Is that an extramarital affair? So many questions with very unclear answers. So one of the biggest questions that's been asked today is around capacity to consent. So how do we even determine capacity to consent? So I wanted to share a story about why consent guidelines are so critical. And this is a story of the Rahans. The Rahans were, oh gosh, I always get this wrong, in Idaho or Iowa, one of the I states. And Henry Rahans on the right was a state legislator. He and Mrs. Rahans got married in their 70s, and they were, by all accounts, super in love. During their marriage, Mrs. Rahans began to develop dementia and eventually moved into a long-term care community. They were always had a very active sex life, and prior to dementia and after dementia. Mr. Rahans would go and visit Mrs. Rahans in the long-term care community. Mrs. Rahans had a roommate, and in the long-term care community or memory care, I'm not quite sure what level of community she was living in. And the roommate began to get very uncomfortable because Mr. Rahans would visit and she would often hear, quote, sex noises coming from Mrs. Rahans' side of the room. And so one of Mrs. Rahans' daughters from a previous relationship became concerned and asked the long-term care community, how do you know my mom has the ability to consent to intimacy with my stepdad? And the long-term care community, from what I can tell from all the articles I put together on this, didn't have a formal or operationalized process of evaluating Mrs. Rahans' ability to consent to intimacy. And so they asked, while they were figuring it out, they asked Mr. Rahans in a meeting to not have sex with Mrs. Rahans. And he said, okay, we won't have sex, but he would still visit. And so there was a time where he was visiting, and the roommate again heard sex noises coming from that side of the room. And they asked Mr. Rahans, did you have sex with your wife? And he said, oh, no, we didn't have sex, but she fondled me. And so they found, I guess they did a rape kit, and they took Mrs. Rahans to the hospital, did a rape kit, found that she had not had sexual intercourse, but found semen on the sheets, and they tried Mr. Rahans for rape. They, being Mrs. Rahans' daughters, during this time applied for guardianship, got guardianship, and then they worked with attorneys to charge Mr. Rahans with rape. So during the period of the trial, Mrs. Rahans and Mr. Rahans had to be separated. They didn't see each other. During this time, Mrs. Rahans was moved to another long-term care community, and Mr. Rahans wasn't allowed to visit her. And during the trial, it was horribly painful for both of them. During the trial, Mrs. Rahans eventually died. And then when the verdict came out, she had died. He didn't get to say goodbye to her. And the verdict was that he was not guilty of rape. And so Mr. Rahans' children were incensed that Mr. Rahans would have to go through this, that they always had an active sex life. And Mr. Rahans was saying, she would always initiate, and she was so interested, and she always seemed like she was interested in having sex when I was there. And so we did, and it was a connecting thing for us. And I didn't see it as problematic because she was pursuing it. And it wasn't hypersexual. It was something that was very consistent with what we did before. And Mrs. Rahans' daughters were very concerned that she was remaining sexually intimate, but were concerned about her ability to consent. And it led to this horrible trial where eventually Mr. Rahans was found not guilty of rape. And the things that come up for me in this trial are the amount of distress of pursuing a rape kit for Mrs. Rayans. Could she understand what was happening to her body and why that would need to happen? And also the separation between them. And Mr. Rayans was saying, I thought sex meant intercourse. I didn't understand that she couldn't fondle me. I thought maybe we just couldn't have intercourse. And so other questions arose around the long-term care community's guidelines, like did they have established guidelines for determining a person's ability to consent? Did they have established sexual health policies? Did they were they able to describe nuances related to consent and all of that? And so I think back to Allison's point that like so many people are so undertrained in this, and that capacity is very nuanced when it comes to sexual consent capacity. And so we're going to dive deep into that now. And the Rayhan story is a really important story for why this conversation needs to be had, why we need to be talking about what sexual consent looks like, and so on. So capacity is the ability to do something. It's a mental, emotional, or physical ability. It's the ability to understand, including risks and benefits, the ability to make a choice, and the ability to communicate the choice. It doesn't have to be a verbal communication. Capacity is not a requirement to act in one's best interest, a requirement to make the choice that others think you should make, a requirement to be able to justify the choice that you're making. So imagine you're working with somebody or you have a family member with diabetes and you say, okay, you can choose probably not an apple because an apple has a lot of sugar. So depending on what their glucose level is, you have a family member who has heart disease or diabetes, you want them to choose the fruit, not probably lettuce, not the donut, right? That's what we want. But the person can make a choice that they don't have to justify, or it's not in their best interest. And so capacity is not a requirement to act in our best interest. Capacity is not generalizable. So this means that capacity exists on a continuum. Many people have the capacity with dementia have the capacity to say yes to light intimacy, like holding hands and petting, but not heavy petting or intercourse. In different stages of the disease, dementia might incapacitate certain types of decision-making, but not others. So this means that a person could lose capacity to drive a car or manage money or even make medical decisions, but still have the capacity to consent to intimacy. Maybe not consent to intercourse, but maybe consent to holding hands and light petting. A person might no longer be able to make, so we just talked about this, financial decisions. Each situation is unique, so our approach and assessment needs to be individualized for each person. One of the challenges is that there are no universally accepted criteria for consent to sexual activity, and the legal standards and criteria for consent vary across states. But researchers identify that one way to protect this basic human right is to engage residents in a sexual consent capacity evaluation when it's indicated. So we don't do this across the board. We only do this when it's really indicated. So there's a framework here for determining capacity to consent to sexual activity. This is pretty comprehensive. Not every consent, capacity to consent situation requires all of this, but this is the most comprehensive framework. So the first is to compile a team or a committee, and this team could consist of maybe a psychologist who's doing evaluations, family members, maybe an ombudsman, occupational therapy or physical therapy, the person's physician, maybe the director of nursing, and so on. And then the person would engage in an assessment, often with the psychologist or a neurologist or sometimes the LCSW or nurse practitioner. They might do some cognitive testing, a semi-structured interview, and then the team discusses and makes a determination. if the person can consent to intimacy. Sometimes the results are you have the ability to be intimate with a person in shared living spaces, but not privately in your room for fear of exploitation or harm. Or fully intimate, it really just depends on the situation. When it comes to sexual decision-making capacity, there are 3 main constructs. 1 is knowledge, 2 is reasoning, and 3 is voluntariness. And so knowledge is, do you actually know what you're doing? Do you know who you're having sex with? Do you misidentify the person for a spouse? In every situation, that might not be a deal breaker. Reasoning includes things like, do you have a sense of how it would be for you if the relationship ended? That's also not always a deal breaker. And then voluntariness is, are you doing this of your own free will and free of coercion? And also, especially in the case of long-term care communities, staff members can never have a relationship with residents. So one of the things that can be so helpful, especially in long-term care, is to have a sexual health policy. So a sexual health policy is a statement of values and guidelines that inform the community culture and response to sexual expression among and between residents. So sometimes a sexual health policy is very simple and states something like, humans express themselves in relationships. It's quite normal for people to be in relationships. Age does not change that. Dementia does not change that. Intimacy is quite normal. Residents often start new relationships. Here's what happens if a new relationship is started in the context of dementia and we're concerned about the person's ability to consent. This is our process. This is what we do to help honor a person's right to sexual expression, but then how we determine consent if consent is in question. When there's no sexual health policy, there are often higher rates of conflict, dissatisfaction, and ombudsman involvement, and also fines and lots of regulations. So I'm not going to go too far into sexual health policy, but it can be very helpful for the resident to enhance a resident's sense of well-being and with a holistic approach, which includes social, emotional, spiritual, physical, and sexual needs. It can help staff to feel effective in addressing intimacy and sexual needs of residents and can give them practical strategies for dealing with specific situations. For family members, it's helpful in that it gives them clear understanding prior to admission about the potential for intimate relationships. It's kind of like an educational tool and an opportunity to ask questions. And for the administration, it helps to establish guidelines and policies so that there's a pathway for resolving dilemmas. I see there's a question in the chat, but will all the parties read it? Yeah, that's a good question. I think the nice thing about some policies like, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name. There's a program in upstate New York at Riverdale, Hebrew Home at Riverdale, has a fantastic long-term care policy. It's actually just a paragraph. So it's very simple. I think most people do read it because it's one of their hallmark features. Though most people don't read the guidelines, and even professionals don't read the guidelines, and you really don't need to know all the ins and outs of the guidelines until there's a question. All right, so what are some recommendations? So common questions arise when there are couples with one person living with dementia and the other not, and I think there are a couple of participants here where either one person is living with dementia and the other is not. I think one person's caring for their parents. One person's caring for a spouse with dementia. And so I wanted just to share that there are lots of ways to be intimate, even outside of physical intimacy. So researchers and relationship experts identify 5 components of intimacy. The first is commitment. It's a sense of closeness, cohesion, and connection. The second is affective intimacy, which is a sense of caring, compassion, and positive regard. Then cognitive intimacy, which is thinking about and awareness of another. Physical intimacy, like sharing a range of physical touch from proximity to sexuality. And then mutuality, which is a process of exchange. In this lecture, we've been really focusing on physical intimacy, which is sharing a range of physical touch from proximity to sexuality. But we don't have to stay here when it comes to intimacy, especially when we're helping families or partners who are navigating intimacy in the context of dementia. And just like, as you recall earlier, sexuality changing with physiological changes, when a person's experiencing a life-altering illness like a dementia disorder, roles in the relationship change. And that can impact intimacy as well, especially if the caregiver does not have dementia and is caring for a spouse who does have dementia. So often the roles shift from partner to caregiver and care recipient, or patient and nurse, or often people will describe a parent-child kind of role dynamic. And so in these patient nurse and parent-child and caregiver care recipient dynamics, often sexuality or sexual intimacy is not on the front of the mind of the caregiver. Often the caregiver's like, our relationship has fundamentally changed. It's not the person I married. And so it can be really complicated for couples who are living with dementia and wanting to maintain some sort of intimacy, but feeling a disconnect, like it's not the person I married. It's not the person, I'm no longer attracted to that person anymore. What are my options here? And so I want to kind of walk through what some options might be. So Natalie Wilton, I think as a social worker, she came up with the 3 T's of maintaining intimacy, and I've elaborated on them a little bit, but Natalie Wilton is sort of the architect of this. So I want to give her some shout out. So the first T is touch. This is maybe to focus on other ways to show affection, like snuggling or holding hands, to try non-sexual forms of touching, like massage, hugging, dancing, and to consider other ways to meet your sexual needs if you're the caregiver in this situation, or even the person living with dementia, like masturbation or even other relationships. So I worked with a woman whose husband had dementia, and for the last, 7 years of his life, he was unable to really engage in conversation, didn't recognize her. For the last 2 years of his life, she took such good care of him that he was bedbound for 2 years, nonverbal, for 2 years, and had 24/7 care around the clock in their home. And she, was vibrant, wanted more intimacy, wanted to have sexual relationships with people, and sort of was in conflict with how to do this and be a caregiver at the same time. And she started to have relationships with other men, and she had some criteria for how she would have these relationships with other men. So even while her partner, her husband, was bedbound, nonverbal, living with dementia in the home, she would have a long distance relationship with somebody so that the relationship wouldn't be too demanding on her, but would provide some sexual benefits without all of the demands of a full relationship. She dated somebody much younger than her, in his 40s, and still, was able to enjoy a sexual relationship with him without the demands and expectations of a relationship. Her primary relationship was with her husband, and she didn't want anything to tarnish that. And she still had sexual needs and desires of her own. I think similar to having these stereotypes that we have about aging and sexuality, I think we have a lot of stereotypes and sort of archetypes that we paint caregivers into these archetypes also, of like this Mother Teresa kind of archetype, where You're just supposed to give and not have any needs of your own, which is incredibly, I think, degrading to the full humanity of a caregiver as well, that the caregiver wouldn't have their own sexual needs. And the idea that a caregiver wouldn't have their own sexual needs and would just have to postpone that. Some caregivers don't mind postponing that. So it's really an individual choice. But I'm saying there are these societal demands that suggest, and I think these images like a Mother Teresa kind of image of a caregiver and what caregivers are, quote, supposed to sacrifice. And so, of course, caregivers also continue to have relationship needs and sexual needs and desires. And so that might be a conversation that you yourself are having with a trusted other person, or a conversation that you may, if you're a professional, that you may be having with caregivers. Also, the other T is time. So spend time with your loved one doing pleasurable activities together. Spend time attending to your own needs and pleasures, and spend time in fulfilling relationships. And so even if you, as a caregiver, even if you as a caregiver don't have a desire to have sex right now, maybe even just spending time in relationships where there's reciprocation can be incredibly fulfilling. And then the third T is talking. So to prompt conversations that you and your loved one can share, like talking about how the two of you met, how perhaps early in the illness course of dementia, to talk about sexuality and changes that are likely to come, and to talk with trusted professionals and friends about the changes in your life and the grief that comes with these changes. Grief is probably one of the most intimate experiences that we go through. Somebody asked, what about if two people have dementia and are starting an intimate relationship? So it's an excellent question. Often each person will have their own dementia journey in terms of their own capacity. And so often when we are doing, if I'm consulting with a long-term care community, it's often two residents with dementia. So if your family member caring for two loved ones with dementia in the home, you might need to get a professional involved to see, like, where is each partner in their own capacity process. Like, is one partner pursuing for intimacy and the other one saying no? If the other one is saying no, even in their body, but the other one's continuing to pursue, what can happen is, like, maybe the person with dementia who's continuing to pursue isn't reading the cues anymore that the person's saying no, and they just keep on and keep on and keep on. And then maybe the other person's not saying no verbally, but is saying no, like moving away or shifting their body. That's also saying no, right? Their nonverbals are moving away and saying that they don't want this with their body. Then you as a family member might have to intervene and say, hey, you might have to intervene and point the person who's pursuing in another direction, or move the person who's saying no to a safer place. Sometimes, like if one is really intent on expressing themselves sexually, they might need to go into their own room. I think the question that comes up a lot for family members and people in long-term care communities is, like, how much do we facilitate the sexuality? Like, are we expected to get people into position? And are we expected to like turn on a pornographic video for the person? And so I think these are excellent questions that don't have really finite answers. Some family members I've worked with, so I was working with a family where person with Parkinson's disease and mild cognitive impairment had moved from one state to another, to his daughter's home in another state, was living with his daughter, was relying on his daughter for all of his basic needs, like food and transportation and doing laundry, had his own room and bathroom, but he didn't have access to much. And it was a new community. He didn't know how to get the things that he wanted or was used to. And so I was meeting with him one day, and he said to me, I really miss my intimate life. And I said, well, tell me about your intimate life. What was that like? And he said that he would look at like pornographic magazines and had an active masturbation practice. And I said, well, how did you get your magazine? And he would tell me in the previous place he lived, he would walk to the store, get it. He lived in more of an urban place, walk to the store, pick up a magazine, take it home, and just have a sort of private masturbation practice. But living with his daughter, he didn't know how to access any of that. When they moved his house, they threw all of his magazines away. And so I asked him, well, would you like me to have a conversation with your daughter?
No.
Would you like to be there?
Yeah.
Are you? Hello.
Okay.
And so I asked, would you like to be there in that conversation? Would you like me to have that conversation with your daughter privately? He asked me to have that conversation privately with his daughter. And so I did. The daughter was much more religiously conservative than he was. And she said, absolutely not. I won't get these magazines for him. I don't want these in my home. This is a Christian home. We don't want these magazines there. And so I said, okay, I respected her boundaries around that. I went back to him and I said, this is what your daughter shared with me. Can you and I talk about other ways of sort of getting this need met? And he was defeated and he said, no, I'm not interested. And so he got this message, not from me, but from society and his daughter, that at a certain point, if you're older and living with a life-altering illness like Parkinson's, then sex is no longer for you. And so he, in that moment, was defeated. He didn't want to meet again. He didn't want to talk about other options. And I respected his boundaries around that. And so sometimes, a family member, there might be another family member who says, yes, I'll make sure he gets, maybe I'll have a male friend or my husband or somebody else help him get the magazines that he wants. So you can have an honest conversation with them and maintain sort of the boundaries between us. But yes, I'll help facilitate this need for him, and other family members not. And so that's often these questions come up in families all the time. But when it comes to two people living with dementia who are starting an intimate relationship, one person may have more ability to consent than the other. And so when a decision is made about how far the intimacy can go, like how far into sexuality it can go, it really, the marker is really with the person who is the most impaired. So if there's a person who has more decision-making ability and they want to go all the way to intercourse, and there's another person who has more limited decision-making ability and can't confidently, in terms of the sort of consent process, say, this is how far I'm going to go and this is not, then a family member or long-term care folks might intervene and say, this is as far as y'all can go in expressing your sexuality for the safety of the person who's more impaired, so that that person doesn't get exploited and taken advantage of. So it might not go all the way to intercourse. So it really depends on each person's ability and each person's, especially the person who's more able, can they also read the cues that their loved one is saying no, or their sex partner is saying no? Can they back off? Sometimes with dementia, we didn't go into this now, but there's also, it's hard to regulate. It can be hard to regulate impulses and emotions. And so it can be hard when the juices are flowing to not continue to pursue sexuality if you're turned on and you have dementia, right? It's hard to manage impulses, or harder to manage impulses. And so there are other sorts of trainings that we could get into that help to identify hypersexuality and what that looks like, and how to manage hypersexuality or unreasonable bids for intimacy. But when it's two people with dementia, you really have to look at each person and what they're able to do, and then make decisions about their ability, and then guide them within the context of their ability. So then there are recommendations for people living with dementia in long-term care. So it's really important to have a sexual health policy. And if you I saw somebody was asking for the Hebrew home at Riverdale, you can just Google that and find it. I also have a download for you I'm going to share with you in a second, and then you can reply to that download, and I'll send it to you. I'll explain that in a second. But a sexual health policy is really important. Sexual health guidelines or sexual consent guidelines are critical for every long-term care community as well. And also, if you're a family member and you're caring for your parents or your spouse, and you're not sure about your loved one's ability to consent, or if one of your parents is saying no and the other is saying yes, 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 you likely will need to get professionals involved to help you navigate that situation. Also, to coach you on what language you can use for separating them, for maintaining their safety, but not alienating them from one another. It can get really messy. Also, it's important that staff get training and family members get training to differentiate healthy versus unhealthy sexual expression. It can help to conduct a sexual health assessment when if a person's moving into long-term care. And so that's just getting a sense of, does this person have a sex life, and what does their sex life consist of? And then to help staff and ourselves and family members clarify values related to sexuality and aging and sexuality and dementia. And then we have to talk with older people about sex. So back to that survey of 1,000 people, 65 to 80, I'll tell you that the vast majority of people, 67%, you might recall, remain interested in sex. However, the majority of their primary care providers are not talking with them about sex. Only 17% of the time are older people having conversations about sex with their primary care providers. And this is problematic because sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia have doubled in the past 10 years for people 65 and older. And it's largely this culture of silence around sexuality and aging. So we have to be talking with older people about sex. It can help to conduct an assessment of sexual history when a person moves into a long-term care or a new home. And intimacy should be addressed in care planning and in long-term care and throughout the illness. And so if you want to learn more about sexual health assessment, I have a little toolkit that you can download. It's at mentalhealthandaging.com/sex. And you can download that toolkit. And you'll get an email with that toolkit in it. And then all you have to do is reply and tell me that you want the Hebrew Home at Riverdale sexual health policy, and I'll send that to you. Happy to send that to you. I could even Google it really quick and find it and put it in the chat box. Also, I would love for you to keep learning at any of our free programs at mentalhealthandaging.com. I have a free podcast that you can listen to. We talk about all sorts of really interesting topics and articles and courses. So check those out.